This is my 20th year as a head teacher in Tottenham.
Yeah.
During that time, and I'm an executive head teacher as well now, so I feel quite in a strong position to be able to tell you about Ofsted's. As over the years, my leadership has been judged satisfactory, requires improvement, good, good, outstanding, outstanding, requires improvement again, good, outstanding again, and then good. So I suppose to the uninitiated, that may signal some sort of rise and fall in the quality of my leadership. But that was certainly the case for some of the parents when I took on the leadership of an outstanding school that hadn't been inspected for 10 years. When I got there and did some initial sort of evaluations of things, I could tell very quickly that the school was actually failing. But that's not what their Ofsted report said. Many parents to this day still blame me for taking the school from outstanding to RI in 2 months. In my defense, the school was lucky to be a judged RI. Anyway, despite what those people think, I've been consistent throughout. My leadership has always been driven by values. My intent as a leader is not chopped and changed. In fact, I would say probably over 20 years, you would hope that my leadership would have improved at some point. So why the variation? Well, we've heard about the variation in judgments of Ofsted already from some of the speakers today. The problem with Ofsted judgments is they don't just reflect the leadership or even the ongoing reality of the school. They reflect the circumstances of the moment often. Perhaps the inspection came very early into my leadership, as was the case in the one that I just mentioned. A new framework focus, and it was interesting hearing people talk before about some of those framework focuses that suddenly head teachers go scrambling around on, working on things that actually isn't a change in the framework, but just the framework focus. Test results, certainly post-pandemic, the most vulnerable schools, our test results were really impacted, on the most vulnerable learners really struggled to get back and still struggle to this day to get back to the learning and standards they had previously. Staff resignations at the wrong time. Last year we had 4 resignations of senior staff. These external matters, the day-to-day lived experience of staff, pupils, and parents, which brings me sort of to the heart of the matter I wanted to talk about is, Ofsted is fundamentally trying to do 2 different things. We've spoken about accountability, but Ofsted also want to pass themselves off as a school improvement tool. Now, those 2 things seem to me to be mutually exclusive. The Beyond Ofsted inquiry that we've spoken about, Jim Knight has led, concluded Ofsted is not fit for purpose. The system is punitive, unreliable, and counterproductive. So I think we can establish that it's not delivering both aims in a single framework. It fulfills both its aims badly. And I would argue that it's only ever been about accountability. The government being able to claim parents that it provides information about schools. In relation to school improvement, I want to quote the great Tim Brighouse, and I know many people in the room will have heard Tim speak. I heard him speak once about school improvement. He said school improvement is about verbs. It's about the things you actually need to do to make outcomes better for pupils. School effectiveness, and Ofsted, is about adjectives, how an inspector would describe a school at that moment in time. The moment is then published and lasts for the next 4 years. And in that outstanding school, which is no longer the case, which is right, but it lasted 10 years. And that was never a fair representation of that school, other than that day that the inspection was made. So Ofsted does a lot of describing, but it provides schools with very little in the way of verbs. So in my own experience, 20 years as a head teacher, Ofsted has never played a genuine part in school improvement, and certainly not the school improvement journey of our schools. Improvement has come from staff, from peer collaboration, which we heard about earlier, from local networks, from my ability to reach out to those really talented colleagues around me, and the development of the staff over that time. Not from inspection. In fact, we don't even use the language of inspection. We talk about being a great school. Being an outstanding school has too much baggage. I try and protect our staff from that constant spectre of Ofsted arriving at the door, because the majority of school staff, the Ofsted experience creates a climate of fear. And the Beyond Ofsted inquiry describes how inspection generates stress, anxiety, and distorts priorities and undermines trust. I talk about in some of the work that I've been doing is Ofsted warps leadership. Leadership doesn't fulfill the requirements that it's supposed to be because it's chasing tick boxing around, standards and narrowing the curriculum. And I've been attending these webinars of Ofsted have been delivering on the new framework. A lot has been made of the claim this framework is designed to take pressure off school leaders, to recognise each school's unique context, and we celebrate that, I suppose, and to ensure there's no additional work, no additional work for inspections. I love the concept of that. We don't even have to write a school improvement plan or a school evaluation document according. I mean, really, what leader on the planet is going to ignore providing Ofsted with those documents? They even say inconsistencies in the quality of the leadership, the inspections will be leveled out because an HMI will be leading the inspection. And on paper, all that sounds reassuring. But I think all of us have probably remain unconvinced. One of the comments during the Ofsted webinar was the inspection framework was values driven. Values driven. Do you know what? They went on without explaining what those values were. I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical. Even putting aside the fact the inspection framework was finalised before the independent wellbeing review was completed, and that was supposed to inform it. School leaders are deeply skeptical. In fact, the whole concept of Ofsted inspecting wellbeing, to me, is a bit like poacher turned gamekeeper. How on earth can they inspect well-being of education staff when they're the major cause of distress in the profession? They warp outcomes, they warp leadership, and they create a well-being problem. The thing I have, and well-being is my thing at the moment. I've got a lot to say on it, and I don't want to spin off in a different space because we might save that for a different case conference. But what I find is school leaders and school staff are disconnecting from their purpose of why they come to work because they are too busy chasing these sort of arbitrary tick boxing exercises. And what we know about well-being is when a person disconnects from their purpose for work, it damages their well-being. I was recently at a conference where one of the speakers said, yeah, the title of their speech was Education System. We're doing a lot better, but we're all feeling much worse. And that sort of wraps it up for me at the moment. The well-being crisis, and I think we're going through something unprecedented in terms of staff well-being. We've got the post-pandemic issues, which I alluded to before, increased parental demands, which we've heard about from earlier speakers. I've been a head teacher, as I said, for 20 years. Up until the pandemic, I had never had an Ofsted, a complaint to Ofsted from a parent. Since the pandemic, I've had three parental complaints to Ofsted. A 2-hour conversation with an HMI interrogating me about this parent's completely unrealistic demands. So I finished the conversation with the HMI saying, listen, Ofsted need to be really, really careful that they're not joining in on a witch hunt of head teachers and school leaders based on unrealistic demands from parents. They need to do their hard work to interrogate whether these are founded or whether they're unrealistic. But once again, don't get me started on some of those elements. We've got the increasing high needs coming into schools. We talk about inclusion. Inclusion's really hard. Budgets are really tight. Reduced funding, reduced resources. The breakdown in support services, which we've heard, schools, social care really challenging, CAMS really challenging, special schools oversubscribed. So there's a real mental health crisis and well-being crisis. And then we've got the well-being and mental health crisis for our young people. I was quite shocked a few years ago when I did a survey of our year 6 pupils in Tottenham to ask them what was the biggest worry they had in their life. And it was SATs. It was SATs tests. So we went back to our leadership team and said, who's responsible for that worry our year 6s have? It's probably us. Is this sort of head teachers passing down the line to school staff, passing down the line to poor old year 6 pupils who are stressed about their tests, right? So anyway, there's a lot going on. We've also got problems of narrowing the curriculum. That's well known. I mean, English and maths now. It used to be science, but that's changed as well. A variant of this narrowing of the curriculum in the last few years has been how schools have been looking really to make their curriculum more diverse. That got sort of hooked up a couple of years ago in these culture wars with inspectors, Ofsted inspectors being told they didn't want to hear schools talking about decolonizing the curriculum, like that was a bad thing. Schools being stopped from creating a curriculum that reflects the young people they serve because Ofsted didn't like that term. And I think we need to be really careful of the influence Ofsted can have on decisions that leaders are making, like I say, warping the decisions they make. Anyway, I could go on about well-being. If anybody wants to see some of the stuff I've said about well-being, just look at my LinkedIn site, and there's a few blogs I've put there. Thankfully, there are people who are talking out about this. I'm not anti-accountability. We've spoken about the word accountability. Schools should have some method of accountability. But, the NAHT and others are talking about that risk to well-being in staff, stress and mental health issues, the expanded number of judgments. They've done away with deep dives to increase it with a range of different inspection areas. So there's a real grading complexity. I mean, like I say, I'm not quite sure what they want from us. I've attended 2 or 3 of these webinars now. I'm in the dark about, what it's going to look like when an HMI walks through the door with his team. And there's my problem as well is this continued detachment for the improvement role. If I think I'll talk about some sort of maybe beyond Ofsted elements as well, and I'll pick up on some of Jim Knight's work there. I'm not going to make it up for myself, but certainly there is certainly there's an issue around making sure that schools are encouraged to improve and not just tick boxes. And then there's this whole risk of misleading parents. Now, parents think that an Ofsted report, as I go back to that school that hadn't been inspected for 10 years, I don't know when it stopped being outstanding and when it became failing, but the parents in the community thought it had been outstanding for 10 years and it really hadn't been. So in short, the new framework looks different on the surface, but underneath, I think it's got all the same old problems. And Ofsted know this. They talk about this, returning to contextual, or not returning to contextual value added, but a comparison to similar schools. As a head teacher in Tottenham, I have complained and argued with Ofsted inspectors for a long time about why our school isn't allowed to be outstanding when a school in Muswell Hill and Crouch End and more affluent areas is judged to be outstanding. It's really, really unfair. So, this whole concept of similar schools and contextualizing the inspection is important, but once again, it's just an admission of how failed the previous inspection regimes have been. So anyway, coming back to Jim Knight's work on this, we need to separate accountability from improvement. We need to end the grading and once again, I don't have a problem with accountability. I don't have a problem with people giving me feedback on areas I need to improve on, but it needs to make sure that it's feeding into an improvement process. Making it genuinely, that support being local, understanding the context and being genuinely supportive, not descriptive, not used, like, to go back to Tim Brighouse, not just giving me adjectives, but giving me verbs, giving me the support I need to identify those areas for improvement, how they can be improved, and the structures around that. Genuinely prioritize staff well-being. Once again, I'm not going to get into it, but defining what well-being is. If I ask, if there's 15, 20, 30 people on this call today, each of you will have a definition of what well-being is for you. That's really unhelpful. We really need to delve into this concept of well-being. We need to define it. We need to make sure that people understand what it is they should be delivering. We need leaders to be creating cultures where there's staff are supported and valued. And we need staff to understanding, their well-being isn't a cold compress on their head from the school leader, but they need to be aligned and supporting the goals and aims and visions of the school as well. Working hard isn't a problem. That doesn't impact on your well-being. Being detached from your purpose impacts on your well-being. So there's work we need to do around that. And if you do that, then you restore the trust and credibility. Anyway. I'm just going to close off by saying, I haven't changed dramatically in those years I've been a leader, but what has changed is when Ofsted have come in and the framework, the timing, the politics of the moment, the staffing of the moment. So we need to take this all seriously, and I think the whole Beyond Ofsted inquiry is really interesting. I think the work that NAHD are doing is really important. I think the work that CASE is doing is really important to start to get that narrative out there, that develop a system that doesn't undermine well-being, that doesn't mislead parents, and no matter how many well-intentioned webinars they deliver, it doesn't create a climate of fear amongst education staff. So as the inquiry Beyond Ofsted says, inspection should be a constructive process, not a punitive one. And hopefully all these voices we're starting to hear can help us make that shift, that we start to feel better rather than worse as a result of an inspection framework and an accountability framework and a support framework that really does what it says on the tin.